But I usually stick to the pitches as they come up out of the charts. I use charts to determine the sequence of pitches.
And is all your music actually? Do you always work from that point, from a series of pitches, or from some
not always
nuts and bolts
no,
and
not, Not always. I mean, with the sketches I'm doing for the string trio at the moment, I started completely just without any system in mind. And but sometimes then you find a system embedded in the way you're working, so you can extract it. And I noticed I was using a lot of chromatic scales, for example, in this, so I might develop that idea. In a way, it's too easy to write predetermined music. Because, I mean, it's not that it's easy. It's always difficult. There's always new decisions to be made. But I had a thought which I put down into a notebook the other day, which is slightly uncharacteristic, because normally I do like to have these guidelines. But I just wrote down for myself, there's something a bit facile about a predetermined system with ready-made solutions. Real composing involves responding to the unexpected, taking an unpredictable turn, encountering the conditions which can't always be anticipated. So somehow, if you're working with a predetermined system, then you don't get that. You just follow whatever the system dictates that you do.
Tell me about these pictures on the wall, actually, then, in that case, because they look kind of...
Oh yes, these are by an artist called Trevor Clark, who is an old friend, and he was a student at Portsmouth when I first started teaching there. And he works in a very systematic, constructive way. That one's Trevor Clark, yes.
Oh, the camera's not letting me see it because of the reflection on the window.
He works very strictly with a given number of elements and certain kind of symmetries and correspondences which you can work out by looking at them and seeing where lines cross and go over and under each other. There's a definite sort of clear relationship between all those structures. This was a present from John Lely.
Oh yes,
which is a book about walking and solitude, walking and sort of being in the world as a walker, as it were. And it's with lots of interesting literary references from the Romantic era, sort of Hazlitt and Wordsworth and Coleridge. And I've only just recently started reading it.
Well, the walk is a historical piece now, of course,
Well, it will be when John's finished doing his text scores, because he's doing a whole section on...
Oh, right.
It's been done a lot in workshops. But now it seems to have gathered a whole lot of theoretical interest around it. It was written with the Scratch Orchestra in mind. And we performed it with the Scratch Orchestra.
Oh, outside Euston.
In various open-air situations, yes. And then I used to use it in workshops and with groups of students in Portsmouth. And then I heard that other people were doing performances of it in different places. But it was only in the last 2 or 3 years that it suddenly seems to have been a revival of interest in it.
Yes, there's been quite a flurry of...
And there have been performances in France and Switzerland. It became part of an exhibition of choreographed movements, which was curated by Mathieu Copeland, who wanted to have a choreographed exhibition which contained no objects but only movements. So he had a group of dancers performing movements which were... He had a group of about 7 or 8 artists who worked with these dancers and produced ways of using the space and the dancers' movements to form a continuous performance, and then that took place in the exhibition space every day. That was the exhibition. He asked me if I'd be interested in doing some new versions of it.
Mm-hmm. And what does into rewrite it, or just simply, you mean new realizations?
Well, new realizations, but I also made up some new rules to. I sort of developed the piece a bit. I like to do it slightly differently each time. I don't really want to always do the original version.
Is there a score though? You have a
yes. There's a text score. Yes.
But if you're changing it all the time, do you consider those to be sort of? Do you consider them to be revisions, so that you would sort of say this is a revision, or do you sort of, or just because
I'd say it's a new version, really.
Yeah.
The old version still exists.
Mm-hmm.
The original version still exists, and other people can still do that. But there are at least 2 new versions now.
Do you have? You don't have it here. That would be nice to look at.
I do have it somewhere, but where?
Oh no, don't worry then.
I'd have to dig it out from somewhere.
Do you have? Where do you keep your works?
Oh, mostly in boxes.
Chris had 2 or 3 huge piles of them on the
piles and boxes, and I've got a filing cabinet, but it's not terribly well organised.
You are considered an experimental composer, but do you consider yourself to be one? What does that mean to you? That's the word. That's what that question I'm trying to find.
Yes, well, I always fall back on the Cage's definition about experimental action is an action the outcome of which is not foreseen.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Do you find that?
Yes, I find that's quite useful. I think, especially in indeterminate pieces. But not all my music is experimental, as I do also like to write fully notated pieces. And I think indeterminacy is one aspect of my work, but I don't necessarily want everything to be indeterminate. So I suppose I'm experimental in some works, but not exclusively so. On the other hand, experimental has now become a sort of historical category, hasn't it, which refers to a particular type of music from America and from Britain in the 60s and 70s. It contradicts the idea of experimental to be a tradition. And then, of course, there are lots of younger musicians and composers who are experimenting in all sorts of ways which don't necessarily have anything to do with what we call experimental. So really, I think it's an attitude. Really, I think it's just a way of not taking things for granted and not feeling obliged to subscribe to any kind of orthodoxy.
I think in the respect of what you're talking about with from that point of view, it seems, and like what you said with the scratch orchestra, it's sort of starting from fundamentals, starting from absolute basics, whereas I suppose composers you wouldn't consider to be experimental are starting already with a notion of what music is.
They've already got a technique and a set of ways of writing music which builds on a great historical tradition.
Starting from a historical sort of tradition.
I suppose they have that feeling of continuing history, whereas experimental music has the feeling of sweeping everything away and starting again from scratch. It's hard to resist all of that historical accumulation, but it's important to keep refreshing oneself with the thought that things can be different. I suppose my basic feeling about composing generally is that I want to put things together in different ways, so that all the traditional building blocks of music can be dismantled and put together in other forms to create unexpected structures. I think that's probably at the root of my feeling of what's experimental.